How can we cultivate beloved community? And how can the stories we tell about strangers and ourselves foster generosity and compassion? These are some of the questions I'm excited to explore with storyteller and activist and author Gareth Higgins in this conversation about the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Tirukural, or in short, the Kural. I am Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and it is precisely because of the beloved communities that I have been nourished by and supported by that I've been able to translate this work into English. And because the Kural is a work which speaks so directly and profoundly to us today in the predicaments that we face, and because it connects to so many different areas of our lives, I've been inviting people into conversation, poets and translators, but also teachers and religious leaders and artists and musicians and healers of all kinds to explore a small number of verses that we come to together to see how they can reveal their gifts to us, how they can help reveal ourselves to ourselves. I am particularly delighted to have as my guest today Gareth Higgins, whose book, How Not to Be Afraid, I'll pull it up here, How Not to Be Afraid, 7 Ways to Live When Everything Seems Terrifying, just came out last year in 2021, and is really a beautiful, heartfelt exploration of how we can actually live in the presence of fear, both real and imagined, and invoked by the stories around us, or revisioned, revised by the stories, perhaps new stories, perhaps old stories that we may resurrect, we may invent, we may create. I came to know of Gareth through our mutual friend Mark Silver of Heart of Business, and so this conversation itself is already the fruit of a friendship, and I hope that this conversation will help to cultivate that friendship and friendships. So it is with great pleasure that I get to welcome you here today, Gareth.
Thank you, Thomas. So I'm just feeling good listening to you talk. It's kind of inducing a sense of well-being and calm. So I'm up for whatever, but I'd be quite happy if you just talk the rest of the time that we're together. Although I know you want to ask me questions, so happy to do that too. But thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much for saying yes and for being here. For some context, what I've done is I've shared one of the chapters from this work with Gareth, and this is a work which has 133 chapters, and they're all very short chapters. They have just 10 very short verses, and each of these chapters deals with some specific area of life. So there's a chapter on rain, there's a chapter on listening, there's a chapter on what it means to be a leader. In fact, there's a whole series of chapters on what it means to be a leader. There's a chapter on love. There's a chapter on listening. And I think of that chapter on listening right now as I hear, you may be able to hear a plane flying overhead our yurt. And, so one of the things this book has helped me to cultivate is the capacity to listen to everything and to make room for everything, even if I might be thinking, oh, there's a darn plane going overhead and I'm trying to record a conversation. So listening to the whole of things. And the chapter that I thought would be interesting to explore with Gareth is the 9th chapter on hospitality. And I chose this because of the 7 ways to live when everything seems terrifying that he speaks about in his book with such eloquence and good humor. The 6th of these ways is to gather and do the work of beloved community. And one of the things that I have experienced most deeply in the years that I spent living in South India, where the Tamil language is spoken, is how central the art and practice of hospitality is to community life, and to the welcoming of others into our communities, or to being welcomed as an other, as a guest, as a friend into a community. So I thought it would be interesting to explore this chapter. So I've shared this chapter. And so my first question, Gareth, is really, of these verses, was there a verse in particular that stood out to you when you first read
Mhm.
them?
Yeah, well, all of them spoke to me, and there's really two that I could start with, but I will limit it to one because you've asked me to do that, and that is uh, verse 83. The life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. The life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. And that that has me thinking about the culture I grew up in was very separate. People lived in a house with their nuclear family, for the most part. And something I noticed when I moved to the US that was different from uh, my upbringing was people had guest rooms in their houses in the US. A lot of people did, but where I grew up, the houses weren't built with guest rooms. And of course, there's a question there about economic privilege, but my parents never had an overnight guest in their circle of friends throughout my childhood. That never happened. Whereas I have guests all the time. My husband and I have guests all the time. And so I grew up in an environment where people stayed separate from each other and strangers were to be feared. And part of that was because I was growing up in the midst of a civil conflict where people did feel an element of risk around sharing themselves with others. And while my parents are certainly generous, warm people, I had sleepovers with my friends all the time. It's a different thing to talk about bringing strangers into your life. Um, and another thing it has me thinking about is a famous story about an anthropologist who was out among a hunter-gatherer people. I think this is sometime in the middle of the 20th century. I could be wrong on the dates. And seeing that after one of the big annual hunts, the alpha male of the tribe was butchering the meat and distributing it around the people who lived in the village. And the anthropologist said, "Why don't you store the meat for yourself?" And he said, "I store my meat in the belly of my friends." And it just means if you share now, you won't want later. Um, and someone else put it in a funnier way that when people stockpile gold for the event of a social economic collapse, and I know there's some people who do that, and I think that's very much there's certainly an element of fear in that decision. um, I heard someone say once, part of the foolishness of that decision, and I mean foolishness in a gentle way, because we all make foolish decisions out of fear and concern. Part of the foolishness of the decision of stockpiling gold is twofold. One is there's no guarantee that gold will be worth anything in the event of a social economic collapse. It may not be worth anything at all. And the second thing, I mean, bread, flour might actually be worth more. And the second thing would be if there was a zombie apocalypse, as they call it. I'm not sure I would want to be the person that everybody knew had all the gold. I'd rather be the person who everybody knew, oh, when he had gold, he shared it. He shared his gold with us. you know, they're the people who get taken care of. So that's what that verse speaks to me. I don't know if that's the intention of that verse, but the life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. I'm certainly not making a case for myself as being anything other than an ordinary person who loves people and loves connection with people. And it is a source of great joy in my life that I live in a culture that emphasizes community, and we're having gatherings all the time. And we know we won't fall upon ruin because we will always have people to call upon. And we know that people can always call upon us.
Well, that's so beautifully put. Because reading a verse like this, if a person takes the verse sort of on its own, they might imagine a scenario. They might imagine a house where there's just a couple people disconnected from a community, and somebody might come in, some stranger might come in, and they might think, are we supposed to take this stranger in? We don't even know who this person is, and we might feed them, and what if they stay for 2 weeks, and then we'll be out of food, and we'll be ruined, right? And what I think is so beautiful right from the beginning of your reflections on this verse is that you can sense how a verse like this is within a community life. There's a whole
Oh yeah.
ecology of relationships involved here. And that ruin comes precisely, or I should say that never falling upon ruin comes precisely from that relatedness, from that ongoing, continuing relatedness with others, which includes those whom we know, our friends and our family, our circle of friends, as well as those who may, for whatever reason, find themselves on our doorstep. And may need something that we can very easily and joyfully give them. And they may, in fact, turn out to be a new friend in disguise, even if that disguise means maybe they don't speak our language, or maybe they have very different seeming beliefs than our own. Maybe they tell a different story about the world. And maybe it's a story we actually need to hear, and we don't even know it yet. But we know, oh, we can open our door to this person, and that opening is not going to be the end of us. It may be a new beginning for us. And I thought this is one of my very favorite verses. I'm thrilled and delighted that you chose it. And I thought I would just share the tummer so you can at least hear a little bit of the original language and how it sounds.
Please.
So the life that cherishes strangers each day never falls upon ruin. Varivirinde vaigolum ombuvan varke, paravande paradalindre. I'll do it again just because we can. Varivirinde vaigolum ombuvan varke, paravande paradalindre. The whole verse ends, in fact, in this case, on no or not or never, which, of course, because of English syntax, I've had to move around in the verse. But there is such a sense of certainty, of a grounded, embodied belief that this ruin that we may imagine, that we may tell ourselves stories about the ruin that may be coming, is illusory, that there's something else much bigger and greater here, and it comes from our interrelatedness.
I love hearing you. I mean, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that never is really strongly emphasized in the original. And I was thinking about I certainly fantasize about ruin. I certainly go down pathways of, oh my goodness, here's all these terrible outcomes that could happen. And two problems with that are, first of all, it takes me away from the experience of whatever is real right now, some of which is joyful, some of which might well be difficult. And the other piece is it's just speculation that keeps me in this place of fight or flight or freeze, rather than enacting something upon the circumstances around me, which might well be a decision to leave. I mean, there's certainly people right now, not just in Ukraine, but that's the most visible example, that are making a thoughtful choice to leave somewhere that has been home for them for their own safety. This is a wise choice, and those of us who are not burdened with the terrible oppression of being a Ukrainian person in Ukraine at the moment need to do everything we can to assist, which is what the verse says: cherish the strangers. So if you can support people who are suffering in this way, then do it. I love also the fact that it doesn't say the life that cherishes strangers each day will never experience bankruptcy or unemployment or illness or difficulty. What it says is it will never fall upon ruin. And ruin is something definitive, and I guess you could call it permanent, cataclysmic. I've certainly known people who perhaps haven't been able to live in the house that they were living in a while because something happened financially that challenged them, or they lost a job, or they experienced a sudden bereavement or a divorce. Pain is inevitable. Ruin is not. I believe, and I haven't seen evidence to disprove this, that there is always someone you can ask for help. And if you don't know how to ask for help, there is always someone who you can ask for help in learning how to ask for help. And if you don't know what the help is that you need, there's always someone you can ask to help you figure out what is the help you need. And and the reason I know this is it has happened to me over and over and over again, where people have helped me. And the times where there was delay in that help coming were mostly because it took me a while to figure out, oh, I'm holding up this help by not asking for it. I'm holding up this mercy, this compassion by not turning to someone I can trust and saying, hey, man, I have no idea what to do right now. Can you just sit with me? I have a friend who is so lovely. Actually, our about 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, I went through a very sad and difficult set of personal circumstances. And I had a lot of friends who supported me. And one of them came over to see me one night and he said, look, I don't know the answers to this, but I will sit in the ashes with you. That was the phrase. I will sit in the ashes with you. And he did. And then last week, well over a decade later, our dog died. And we had a peaceful farewell to our beautiful dog, Tupelo, and grief. And we're in the early stages of grief regarding this companion, this friend who's been with us for a long time. And the very same friend who said to me over a decade ago, I will sit in the ashes with you, he sent me a message on Instagram saying something very similar. He said, I am feeling the sadness with you. He did not say, I'm going to resurrect your dog. Or I'm going to take your grief away. He just said, I'm going to be in it with you. And that's where I want to go. And I'm not there, but that's what this verse kind of leads me to want to go to.
Well, now it's my turn to say that I could just turn everything over to you and just sit here and listen. It's so beautifully spoken and so grounding and uplifting at the same time, which is how I experience a tree, for instance, rooted and touching the heavens.
Oh man, wow.
So beautiful.
That's an image. I like that image.
I'm curious, as you were looking at these verses, if there are others that also you mentioned that others may have jumped out at you. I'm curious what they might be.
Well, 82, which is almost like an inversion of many of the other verses, which are, and the other verses, many of the other verses are promises of prosperity. And it's not financial prosperity in the simplest sense. It's not the kind of prosperity that you would become selfish about. It's the prosperity that you'd want to keep giving more away. But this is an inversion. 82, it says, with a guest at the door, it is not worth eating even the nectar of the gods. And please correct me if I'm misreading this, but I'm understanding that to say that the guest is waiting at the door, but you're not inviting them in.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it is a very strong picture of, it's almost like a king at a banqueting hall with more food than he could possibly eat. And there's someone at the door begging, and he is silencing the noise of the person asking for help, and eating and eating and eating and just sort of stuffing himself. And the verse is saying, how could you possibly enjoy? You can't, even if it was the nectar of the gods, you couldn't enjoy it if you knew about the suffering. And of course, this is true for anybody with privilege, that there will always be people suffering. And so I don't think this is a teaching about trying to make us feel guilty. In the tradition that I hope I am an inheritor of, the Jesus tradition, Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. And I don't think this means don't care about the poor. It means life is going to be lived in light and shadow. And what you do with your privilege is to share it with others who lack that privilege. And what you do with your needs is to find trustable people to ask to support you with those needs. And we have to get out from under the tragic narrative that says that our lives are ultimately, nasty, brutish, and short. We have to get out from the tragic narrative that says there's nothing we can really do. to repair things or to make things better. And we also, I think many of the people who might be watching or listening to this are probably people who are already oriented toward the common good. People are already activists, people are already meditators, and who've had a revelatory experience of what life is for. And the shadow I see in that community, which I am humbled and joyful to be a part of, the shadow I see is a shadow of guilt at never doing enough. The work is never done, and how could we possibly enjoy ourselves? To which I would say, I heard a lovely story about Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, who I had always thought lived in voluntary poverty. And that's only partly true. It turns out she really liked beautiful things. And she saw herself as a steward of those beautiful things. And the difference between her and the mainstream wisdom would be if you came into her home and she saw that you were captivated by one of the beautiful things that was in her home, she would just give it to you. And then you could be the steward of that for a while. And so I want to be the king who opens the door of the banqueting table. I don't need to be the king. I'd be happy to be, let's just call me a junior member of the royal household. Like the king has a lot of responsibility. I'd like to work for a benign king, and we open the doors of the banqueting hall and everybody can come in, and then we make more of this together. It doesn't mean there's no boundaries. You know, you got to go to sleep at some point. And so yeah, that's I like this notion that even that, you know, there's another teaching in the scripture, the tradition I'm from, that says that basically if you get everything you selfishly want, then you have your reward, which means there's going to be nothing for you in the afterlife. And like, ultimately, do you enjoy having all this stuff at the expense of your fellow humans? How about we learn to hold it loosely, to share it? And another piece that brings me life and thinking about this verse is a red letter day moment for me was nearly 30 years ago. I was in an undergraduate philosophy course. I did one semester of undergraduate philosophy and it baked my brain, and I had to withdraw and move to do other stuff. It was just too much logic for me. And there's other people who have much more aptitude for that kind of stuff than I did. And we did this thing called the lifeboat dilemma. Fairly typical problem in philosophy. You're on a lifeboat, there's 6 seats, but there's 7 people on the lifeboat. Who do you throw overboard? And then they would go through the list of who the people are, and it would range from Hitler through to your grandmother, to your best friend, to someone who had a terminal illness, to a baby, and of course to you. You know, who do you throw overboard? And you know, people were getting really exercised about, well, we should probably throw Hitler overboard, or we should throw the elderly person overboard because they've had a lot more life, or the person with the terminal illness is going to be dead soon anyway. And the thought arose in me. It didn't come from me, because it wasn't a mark of character. It was just the thought arose in me, like, I'd feel too guilty to throw anybody overboard. And then the next thought was, the only person that I can choose to throw overboard is me. And if you believe in what some people call positive flywheels of desire, if you threw yourself overboard, somebody else in the boat would be like, you don't have to do that. How about we tag team this and we can take it in turns? You go into the water for 10 minutes and tread water. Then you can climb back up in the boat and I'll go into the water and tread water for 10 minutes. That feels very similar to if you have a guest at the door and you're enjoying life at their expense, you're not really enjoying it. I really wouldn't be able to enjoy being on the lifeboat if we had thrown someone overboard.
That's so beautifully put. And there's so much that all that you've shared and the stories you've shared and your reflections is drawing out from me, drawing up in my experience. One of the things is that this nectar of the gods is understood to be the nectar which you drink it and you never die.
Mm.
In fact, it's a little bit more explicit in the Tamar, which is why part of my effort to translate these verses has included putting a commentary in the back of the book and giving little notes, and just so that that can become more clear,
Mm-hmm.
that this is the elixir of eternal life right here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even that, I mean, again, we're taken to that
Mm-hmm.
extremity. On the one hand, we have the never. On the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
he said, even the elixir of life, even what would grant you eternal life, the life of the gods, that is not worth drinking alone. That's not worth
Oh,
drinking with this person
yeah.
outside the door, because of
Yeah.
what it means to be.
Yeah.
What does it
Yeah.
mean to eat? What does it
Yeah.
mean to be together in this embodied experience on the earth? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've known people, I've known families there, still today in the state of Tamil Nadu, where you know, there is every single day there is something to eat. And there is the
Mm-hmm.
thought, maybe tonight someone will come and we get to feed them. And they might even wait for a very long time. It's like, well, I guess they're not coming tonight. We'll have some dinner. Maybe tomorrow. Uh, and ordinary people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the other thing that occurs to me to say, I love that you brought in the image of a king, right? And imagine the grandeur of the king's banquet table, which is
Yeah.
that this chapter comes in the first of the three parts of this book. And
Yes.
this is the chapter about the householder. So people who
Yes.
are making lives at home, being at
Mm-hmm.
home in a place, which
Mm-hmm.
includes so deeply being a part of a community, having a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
household which is interrelated with other households. And then this leads into the second part of the book, which we could say is about prosperity,
Mm-hmm.
power, wealth, and very specifically, kingship. And so I love that already the image of the king or of a leader, of a sovereign, is already
Mm-hmm.
present,
Mm-hmm.
because they all do, in fact, interconnect. The whole work
Mm-hmm.
interconnects in this way,
Mm-hmm.
so that, the humblest householder to the highest king, queen,
Yeah.
sovereign of the largest of lands.
Yeah.
Um, this applies to them all.
Yeah.
This is true for them all, and in fact is even perhaps more so
Or
for
so.
the
Sure.
ones who find themselves with more power and more privilege.
Well, and yes, and I I think that the metaphor of the king is also about my own sovereignty over myself and the way in which I can exercise sovereignty in the midst of other people. Now, everybody else has a sovereign too, and so this isn't about lording it over other people, but the bounty and the abundance that I have may not necessarily be tangible goods. It may not be a boar roasting on a spit in a medieval banqueting hall or some plant-based delicacies. It may be the heart that I can share, maybe the time that I can share. And one little and I think a lot of people, particularly people of good heart, are timid because compassion often arises from folks who've been taught to be timid because they see the little things, and then but there's a transformation that's invited to happen where timidity can become sovereignty, and it doesn't mean it goes around screaming at people, although sometimes in any given life a few good screams will probably come, and a few good no you will not do this thus far and no further, that will happen for most of us. But much of the time, the words we can speak don't have to be screamed, and the sovereignty we can exercise doesn't have to be loud. It can just be the heart being shared, and it always comes back to you. We had a situation where a friend of ours needed a place to stay. We offered it to him, and we said, "If you need a place to stay, come stay with us." And he stayed for 3 years, and we weren't expecting 3 years. And I'll tell you this, by the end of the 3 years, when he was getting ready to move back to England, we didn't want him to go. And that doesn't mean that there was no point during those 3 years where we thought, it'd be kind of nice to have our house back. But overall, it was it's a cliche and it's reductionist to call it a two-way street. I think it's much more kaleidoscopic than that. It's not just exchange, it's not supply and demand. but there was a circular gift being given there. And you navigate it, and you negotiate, and you discern it, and you figure out what are the boundaries and how do you live together in homes. But what we gave each other wasn't so much tangible as it was the heart. And Richard's heart came back to us, our heart came to him, and that's eternal, actually, even though we don't even live in the same country anymore. That's an eternal gift that still exists among the three of us.
That's so very beautiful. With my husband David, one of the things that we aspire to ourselves is to be able to welcome. And we haven't had a friend come and stay with us for such a time. We did have a cat that we inherited and that lived with us for many years, and those were very precious years. And in some ways, that cat Callie was as much a teacher to us as we were, offering a place for her. Our guests are of many kinds, and our families are of many kinds. I mean, my own experience living in the state of Tamil Nadu, not only living with the man who taught me Tamil and who helped me become able to even dare to translate a work like this, but there was also a village outside the city of Madurai, which is an ancient cultural capital of the land of Tamil, which is how we could translate the word Tamil Nadu. It's still today very bustling and vibrant city. But this village, I mean, I had moved into a small room. I'd rented a small room, and I expected of myself that I would be fairly self-sufficient. I didn't want to depend on any of my neighbors unduly. And my neighbors weren't having any of it. They saw this, young American who was starting to speak some Tamil, and they would see me, going to the store and getting the rice and getting the vegetables and cooking a meal for myself. And there was this one grandmother, and she comes up to me, she says, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Just any number of these houses, their doors are open. Just go and eat with them." And she was speaking a deep truth of this village community. And in fact, my landlord's family, they said, we can't stand it. We see you over there. And I wasn't, I was living very simply. I didn't even have electricity. They had said, "Oh, we'll put in a light for you." And I said, no, I'm going to have my kerosene lamp. And they said, we look over there, you're in the dark, you're cooking this meal for just one person. Just come over here and eat. And in fact, that was the first invitation to, the first step to this family becoming my family, becoming one of my families, and me becoming another of their sons, another of their brothers. And that's now 20 years. And it continues, and it continues. And now I have, I have nieces and nephews, and I have even grandchildren, and I've watched, beloved elders, die, and all of these things. A gift beyond words, these kinds of gifts, the way we not only give ourselves to each other, but give ourselves back to each other, renewed, reawakened, re-enlivened. I think we may have time just for one more verse or two verses. Good. If there's any other that sort of jumped out at you.
Well, this is the piece that, as another person said, first of all, anything that's good that I say, somebody else said it to me first, but that's not being falsely self-deprecating, because the truth is somebody said it to them first as well. There's nothing original. We just get to kind of massage and recalibrate and revise and bring two. Maybe it may well be that if I say two wise things, that I'm putting two things together that hadn't been said before. But that's the same with anybody. So someone said to me recently that the ancient teaching that is found in various forms throughout the world's religion and wisdom traditions, that the teaching is not love your neighbor instead of yourself. It's love your neighbor as yourself. And, and that means you don't have to let your neighbor harm you. You can actually choose to allow that to happen if you feel it would fulfill a higher purpose, but you don't have to let that happen. And the verse 87 says, we cannot foretell the good of offering. It rests on the nature of each guest. And I hear that in both a positive and a negative direction, that like we have no idea what will be, what the ripple effect will be of any act of kindness we show to anybody. And we also can't guarantee that it will be well received either. And it doesn't matter. It does not matter. Or maybe it's not accurate to say it doesn't matter. It's not up to us how it lands. And if a guest doesn't take it well, then that's on them. I did this myself. I remember 25 years ago, maybe even longer, my friend Johnny's dad, lovely, lovely man, showed me a book. And he said, I thought you might be interested in that book. And I looked at the book and it looked interesting. And then I handed it back to him because I didn't realize he was saying to me, I am giving you this book as a gift. I just heard him say, I thought you might be interested in that book. I thought he was saying you might enjoy buying that book somewhere. And it was probably months later that I realized, oh my goodness, I just gave a gift back to the person who was giving it to me. And so we can do these things unconsciously. It doesn't have to have a big negative value judgment associated with it. So, but of course, isn't it always the case that if you've done something yourself, it's easier to be compassionate to someone who's making the same mistake in your presence? I think this is often the case with parents and their children. As I've looked at my childhood regrets and my regrets at 47 as well, about how I see now much more of what my parents sacrificed for me and my siblings. I see much more of what they gave for me and for us. But of course, when I was a child and a teenager, I also saw the bits that I didn't like, you know, the bits that everybody sees in their parents that they don't like, or the frustration or discipline, whatever it meant. It certainly wasn't, you know, the drama in our lives had much more to do with the pain in our society. I sometimes have felt guilty. I have winced when I've thought, oh my goodness, when I remember they bought me a keyboard, they bought me an electronic keyboard when I was about 13. I hardly ever used it. And I never learned how to play the keyboard. And I don't know how to play the piano to this day. And I have felt guilty about that. And then what came to me was, you know what? This is what parents are supposed to do. And children are supposed to learn, and adults are supposed to learn maturity through immaturity and through experimentation and discovering, nah, that's not for me, or that is for me. I have become a creative person, and I'm willing to bet, and I'm actually going to ask my parents about this, and I'm sure they'll say yes, that they don't feel that buying the keyboard was a mistake. They feel like I became a creative person, just not a piano player. You know, but even if they do feel like, well, that was a bit of a waste of money, they're also able to process that on the basis that I'm sure they did similar things to their parents. It's just part of growing up to learn how to be a good receiver and a good giver and a good steward and a good guest.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully put. I love your drawing our attention to this verse because it, you know, I was thinking about the lifeboat scenario, which in fact is a very commonly told story in the culture of philosophy classrooms, undergraduate classrooms. Um, is that this verse simultaneously acknowledges that we don't know what the nature of this guest is in our home, and it also implies that we don't invent the calculus. This is the person we treat really well because it's going to bear fruit, but not that one. That's the bad apple. So just, you know, leave them at the door and we'll drink our elixir of life, right? There's a way in which there's a extraordinary humility that can be cultivated taking a verse like that to heart, whereby we open our arms with care and with generosity to another, to someone we may not know, knowing that we don't know them, that
Mm.
and that we don't know how what we do, the kindness we may show them, will ripple out, and we do it anyway because the doing is somehow good, and there is a larger world and a larger ecology of relationships in which we are held.
Yeah,
And, so we don't
yeah,
have to figure it all out. We don't have to predict. Um,
absolutely.
uh, well, this has been such a pleasure. Before we close, I'm curious if there are any questions you had for me about these verses, about this work, anything at all that's occurred to you as we've
Yeah,
talked.
yeah. I am curious about what it is to introduce something into a culture that most of the people encountering this work of translation, this embodiment, will have little to no familiarity with it at all. I certainly had none, and was delighted to be introduced to it. What's it like to be the person shining a light on something that for many, many, many people is just a deeply embedded part of their culture, but you're in a culture where most of the people here don't know anything about this?
It's a really beautiful question. And there are a bunch of different answers that are all vying for my attention. It's daunting,
Mm,
at one level. It's deeply humbling at another level. But to be more specific, uh, there is at the same time for me an interesting parallel journey because I grew up knowing nothing about the Tamil language. I knew about
mm,
India as a place. I
mm,
was fascinated as a child by India, but I didn't know about this specific language and this specific extraordinarily rich literature that it has had continuously for more than 2,000 years. And I also had a strange impediment, which may not have been an impediment at all, which is that for a chunk of my schooling, and particularly
mm,
in my teen years and early 20s, I didn't get poetry. Poetry
mm,
seemed
mm,
a kind of obscure thing you had to study in school and you might pretend to get. Um, I often didn't get it, and I still pretended like, oh yeah, poetry, that's an important thing. I better go and I'll go do my math homework now. Uh, and and so I went through a kind of journey myself,
yeah.
encountering the language, encountering the cultural riches
Yes.
connected to this language, and then encountering poetry through Tamil. It was really encountering poetry in Tamil that returned me to the capacity, which I also know I had as a child, to delight in the music of words, the rhythm of words as something beautiful and joyful in and of itself, and which
Mm,
also goes on to color our meanings, our understandings of the meanings of words. Tamil gave that back to me and returned me after my first several years of living in South India to English and to the place where I'd grown up with new ears. I could
mm,
hear English in a new way, and that
mm,
began me on my own journey and apprenticeship as a poet. Um, so, along with the feeling of being a bit daunted and the being humbled by this task is also my own sense of having gone through that journey over a much longer period of time of coming to
mm,
know work I'd never heard of before and finding in it something, many things deeply meaningful. And so what's really been most delightful has been being in conversation with people like you,
mm,
and finding how not only how these verses can speak to
mm,
so
mm,
many different people in so many different ways, but how they also occasion um, conversation
mm,
of
mm,
very rich and
mhm, mhm,
delightful and life-giving kinds.
mm,
They offer themselves as a way of deepening our interrelatedness with each other. And so
mm,
I guess if I had to put it all into just one word, I would say gratitude. I
mm,
feel very grateful to be in this position that I would never
mm,
imagined,
mm.
never have imagined myself being in.
Well, I
So
feel grateful too to Mark for introducing us and for this lovely conversation. And I wish you extremely well with this work, which I think can only bring light to anybody who touches it.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And for those watching or listening, if you'd like to know more about Gareth's work, if you want to learn about his book and many of the initiatives, that he's involved in, you can visit garethhiggins.net. And I encourage you to explore the wealth that he has to offer so freely and abundantly. Thank you again so much for being here. It's been really a great pleasure and a great honor.
Me too, Thomas. Thank you.